Hey everybody, so welcome to my channel, and I'm just gonna get right into it. What I wanted to discuss today is something that I'm gonna make a disclaimer at the beginning does have a lot to do with concrete definition of certain terminology within the gender expression and gender identity scale. So if you're not really interested in me researching and the outcome of my research of these terms as defined clinically, I suggest that you click out, because I know that some people have very strong opinions about concretely defining these things. However, I will add that my intent by defining these things is not so much to marginalize and box in the gender identities and expressions themselves, but to differentiate them from certain medical conditions that they have been associated with or confused with in the past. That being said, I'm going to say that specifically I'm going to be focusing on what the definition, quote-unquote, of bigender is versus the definitions of multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia, which I have experienced it being confused with, both having had those two words thrown at me and having seen them being thrown at other people who identify as bigender. So that is essentially what I'm going to be talking about. First up, I'm going to read the definition of the American Psychological Association of certain gender nonconforming, non-binary gender identities. While the APA did make a distinction between trans people, that is to say FTM and MTF, and other categories falling under the trans umbrella, they did define them as being part of the same scale, part of the same spectrum. So keeping that in mind as we continue on, and here's the definition first of genderqueer. Genderqueer is a term that some people use who identify their gender as falling outside the binary constructs of male and female. They may define their gender as falling somewhere on the continuum between male and female, or they may define it as wholly different from these terms. Some genderqueer people do not identify as transgender. Other categories of transgendered people include androgynous, multigendered, gender nonconforming, third gender, and two-spirit people, which is part of the definition of bigender, at least it was on Wikipedia when I looked it up. And granted, Wikipedia is not always the most reliable of sources for obvious reasons. I will say that I think that two-spirited, which I believe comes from a Native American belief, does act as another way of saying bigender. Exact definitions of these terms vary from person to person and may change over time, but often include a sense of blending or alternating genders. Some people who use these terms to describe themselves see traditional binary concepts of gender as restrictive. So, as you can see, that's a very loose definition, but it is the only definition of these terms that I could find on their website, since it is the association that I see most often cited by people when trying to define terms such as genderqueer and bigender. I thought it would be prudent to go straight to that source to see if there's any truth to the fact that they have acknowledged and defined those terms, which, according to this article, they have sort of touched upon, but they haven't given as distinct of a definition to each of those terms as they have to transgender. Also in this article, they discuss the differentiation between non-binary identities and cross-dressing, which is another thing that I've seen being used almost in an insulting way towards non-binary people to invalidate their identity. So the American Psychological Association defines cross-dressing as such: people who cross-dress wear clothing that is traditionally or stereotypically worn by another gender in their culture. They vary in how completely they cross-dress, from one article of clothing to fully cross-dressing. It is my understanding that cross-dressing does not imply that the person who does it feels like or wants to be in any capacity or form any other gender or than the one they were assigned at birth. They simply use cross-dressing, much as in cosplay, as a form of art, as a hobby, and it has nothing to do with how they want to be perceived by society as far as their gender is concerned. Now moving on to a little bit more of a touchy subject, I think, which is the distinction between being specifically bigendered and the clinical definition of multiple personality disorder and schizophrenia. So, for the definition of multiple personality disorder, which I discovered has been renamed dissociative identity disorder, so I'm going to be referring to it as DID, as they did in Psychology Today, which is where I am getting my definition from. Dissociative identity disorder is a severe condition in which two or more distinct personalities or personality states are present in and alternatively take control of an individual. The person also experiences memory loss that is too extensive to be explained by ordinary forgetfulness. DID reflects a failure to integrate various aspects of identity, memory, and consciousness in a single multidimensional self. Usually, a primary identity carries the individual's given name and is passive, dependent, guilty, and depressed. When in control, each personality state, or alter, may be experienced as if it has a distinct history, self-image, and identity. The alter's characteristics, including name, reported age and gender, vocabulary, general knowledge, and predominant mood, contrast those with a primary identity. Certain circumstances or stressors can cause a particular alter to emerge. The various identities may deny knowledge of one another, be critical of one another, or appear to be in open conflict. Let's just break that down a little bit. On the surface, I can see why that would be confused with what it means to be bigender. If somebody were to really dig into this and into the neurological explanation for some of these phenomena, perhaps these could be linked. I don't know that. I don't know that we should even know that, because I think that finding out why precisely people do identify with what they identify as and so on and so forth, it would have or could have potentially unsavory ramifications. That being said, there are certain parts of this particular definition that I would say do differentiate bigenderism from DID. The main one in this case being this idea of losing your memory or not being able to know what you've been up to when your alter takes effect. I've never ever heard of and have done extensive research into people who identify as bigender and their stories and videos and so on and so forth, and I've never heard one of them ever say that they suffered memory loss when they switched from boy to girl mode and vice versa. I would also argue that I have very seldom heard of people who are bigender not acknowledging that while they have two different genders and while the personality might change slightly, I've never heard them describe it as being two completely different people with different memories and different vocabulary and different knowledge and things. I have heard people say, and it's something that I could say I experienced personally, you can watch my video, What Bigender Looks Like, which could probably make this a little bit more clear. There are personality shifts on account of your gender shift, because as each gender you maybe have more dominant traits than when you are the other one. They were in you as one person, they just are easier to express as one gender or the other. I find it easier to concentrate in school in girl mode than guy mode, for example. School as a thing is important to me, period. That's it. And while I have a bigger sexual appetite as a boy than as a girl, the way that I define my sexuality does not change. I am one person with both the genders that I identify as at different given times, and that gender expression comes with it personality shifts. Not that at one minute I can play chess really, really well, and at the next minute I can't play it at all. It's just a matter of certain traits becoming more or less dominant depending on which gender I'm identifying as at the time. Next up, I'm going to move to the definition of schizophrenia. I think once I read the definition, once again from Psychology Today, of clinical schizophrenia, it will become very apparent why bigenderism and schizophrenia have absolutely nothing to do with each other. So here we go. Schizophrenia is a disabling, chronic, and severe mental illness. Symptoms include hearing internal voices, thinking that other people are reading one's mind, controlling one's thoughts, or plotting harm, which may leave a person feeling fearful and withdrawn. Their disorganized behavior can be perceived as incomprehensible or frightening. People with schizophrenia may not make sense when they talk. They may sit for hours without moving or talking. Sometimes people with schizophrenia seem perfectly fine until they talk about what they are really thinking. I went on to read the entire article. It is something that is not thrown about lightly in the medical community because it is a lifelong disease. There are certain things that people suffering from schizophrenia, as I understand it, can do to alleviate certain symptoms and to live what they call a meaningful life in their community. However, it is something that they will have to struggle with their entire lives, and it can be stressful for them, certainly, for their families, for their caregivers, so on and so forth. And as you can see, none of those things have anything really in common with what it means to be bigender. I feel very confident now in telling people who throw that card and throw that word around, either of them, that they're absolutely incorrect. I know what I'm doing at all times, all points of the day. I am not withdrawn or depressed. I don't feel guilty. I don't have voices telling me what to do. I don't see things that nobody else can see. I know that I am one person. My memories are always mine, regardless of what mode that I am in. They're always the same. I am 19 years old. I am never anything older than that. I have 2 different names that I use, but I mean, that's simply a way for me to help other people know what mode I'm in and what pronouns to use and so on and so forth. My personality shift has very little to do with feeling like another person, which I do not, and has much, much more to do with certain traits becoming more or less dominant depending on my gender identity. This is simply a matter of gender, not a matter of personality, so to speak, although the personality changes do come with my shift in gender. So I hope that that cleared things up, both for people who identify as bigender and have had those other 2 labels or cross-dresser thrown at them, and for anybody who was curious as to what the difference is exactly between being bigendered and being schizophrenic or suffering from DID or being a cross-dresser. And that is my video for all of you guys today. Feel free at any time to check out my Facebook page. I link a lot of information on non-binary identities there. I link a lot of LGBT news there. And I also would define it as a safe space for discussion and for questions and to meet other people and make friends and so on and so forth. I've also linked my Tumblr. My ask is always open, but it's not specifically directed at any of these issues, although I do blog about them. I've also linked my collab channel, Golden State Boulevard, which is primarily an FTM, MTF, and non-binary collab channel in which we discuss various topics pertaining to ourselves and to the community. And all of those links are down in the undercarriage, as are the links to the articles that I was reading my definitions from, if you care to check them out yourself. Feel free to comment subscribe and or post a video response to this video. I would be curious to see what anybody else has to think about using definitions as a way of validation. And yeah, so I will catch you guys next time. Take care.